Welcome to this edition of Citywide. About 2 years ago, our guest was the CEO of the nonprofit, nonpartisan Conference Board. They're the publisher of the Consumer Confidence Index and the leading economic indicators. Well, a great deal has transpired since that conversation, and we're pleased to have Jon Spector back on again. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
It's nice to be back.
So, I'm sure that some of our audience is more familiar with the things that the Conference Board does than the organization itself. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are and some of the activities of the Conference Board?
Well, as you said, we are a not-for-profit organization. We're headquartered in New York. We have about 250 staff globally, although most are located in the city. We are a membership organization, so you and I can't join. Big corporations are members, about 1,500 corporations around the world. And our mission is twofold. First, to help our member companies improve their business performance. But secondly, and importantly, to help them better serve society. And so some of the work that we do, in addition to publishing the economic data that you described, and a lot of other economic data as well, we convene conferences, public conferences, we convene private meetings of executives, all designed to identify business best practices or to work on important issues at the intersection of business and society. Issues like how to improve education, the controversy around executive compensation, things of that sort.
So just tell us again, the Consumer Confidence Index, the leading indicators index, why are they important?
Well, they are both very high-level monthly measures of the performance of different aspects of the economy. The Consumer Confidence Index is a survey. It's a huge survey, 5,000 people a month, a sample of the United States. Basically ask the question, how are you doing now, and how do you think you'll be doing 6 to 9 months from now? The questions are a little bit more complicated than that, but not much. And we've been asking these questions for 50 years, and so we have a very good history of how confidence goes up and down over time. The measure of a strong economy is when consumer confidence is at 100. Right now it's at about 70. It's been as low as 30 over the last 18 months, and that indicates, very serious lack of confidence. Why is consumer confidence important? Well, it drives business decisions. CEOs and business leaders don't invest when confidence is low because they think that consumers won't spend, and consumers don't spend when confidence is low because they lack the confidence. So it's a very important, simple indicator, but anyone, whether you're an economist or just the man in the street, can look at consumer confidence as a rough indicator of how things are going, and it's going up. It's going up quite consistently now. The leading economic index is not a survey. It's a compilation of 10 economic factors. Again, we've been publishing this for decades. It's a very, very good advanced measure, about 6 months in advance, of whether the economy is going to improve. And in April of this year, of 2009, the leading economic index turned up after a long decline, which means that starting about October, the economy should begin to improve. And the index really is quite reliable, and lo and behold, starting in the fourth quarter, we saw the economy beginning to improve.
So 2 years ago, you were kind enough to come on the show, and we were talking about what our viewers should be looking for in the financial news in the months ahead. There was a lot of chatter at that time about the subprime mortgage situation, but it wasn't clear whether it was going to affect anybody other than the people in the institutions who were directly involved. And what you said was that the thing that we needed to look for was whether or not the government decisions were from the normal arsenal of tools for economic stimulus package that you pointed out, keeping interest rates low or injecting some capital through tax refunds. What you said was that's the normal course of events. But, because of these ups or downs, I think if we start seeing more radical initiatives that appear to be needed and that the government is going well beyond what is currently talking about, then I guess that would be a sign of concern that maybe things aren't typical. How'd that work out?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, Ken. But obviously, what's happened over the last 12 months really is unprecedented, not in terms of the economic cycle, and that's an important thing to recognize. One of our Conference Board economists, Victor Zarnowitz, who recently passed away, discovered the business cycle. economies go up and they go down. And that's precisely what happened here. It was significant. I don't want to say the most extreme. There's some debate about that, but it was a significant cycle. But economies do go up and down. But I think what we saw this time, because of the global nature, the global interrelationship of the economies, and the speed with which the economy was deteriorating, that you saw the government take truly unprecedented actions. And because of the availability of information and the public nature in which every decision in Washington is now made, we all got to observe this decision process, and this whole thing unfolded really very, very publicly. It was really quite extraordinary.
So have we turned the corner?
Absolutely. From a macroeconomic point of view, I think everyone agrees we have turned the corner. There was actually quite robust growth in the United States in Q4. Some are estimating it at 4%. That's a seasonal aberration, so to speak, but it was solid growth. We are forecasting, everyone is forecasting economic growth for 2010. The question is how much. We're on the conservative side. We can chat about that if you'd like. But very, very clearly, job losses have slowed. In November, we actually picked up some jobs for the first time in 24 months. The number of jobs actually grew by a very small amount. So there are many, many small signs, and it's very, very clear that we've turned the corner. I think the question is not whether we've turned the corner, but where do we go from here?
Well, I also want to, when economists talk about growth, there seems to be a disconnect from the impact that has on the lives of people. Now, certainly, over the last decade, there were new businesses, new housing. People got to buy bigger TVs and cars and houses. But we also now seem to know, I think, that adjusted for inflation, the wages of the vast majority of the American public were flat during the last decade. A lot of the growth was artificially stimulated by the easy availability of credit. So now when we talk about the economy starting to grow again, does that mean that there'll be jobs? Does it mean that people will have raises? Will property values come back?
Well, again, those are... I'd like to answer those questions generally rather than predicting what's going to happen in the housing market in March, because I don't want people going out and investing on my words. But I think broadly speaking, first of all, I think it's important to say that during the last couple of decades, despite the financial pressures that and financial problems that were being created, in the United States, productivity grew dramatically. And as an underlying long-term force, productivity growth ultimately creates wealth. And so while there are stresses and pressures and significant problems that we face, we can't ignore them. The U.S. economy, from an underlying basis, has the great strength of productivity growing. And in fact, productivity grew last year as well. It grew in part because of job losses, but it grew nonetheless. And that's a great and enduring strength of the U.S. economy. When economists talk about growth for the future, I think they do mean the recovery in all of the areas that you described. Exactly the degree of recovery is not clear, but yes, it does mean more jobs being created. It does mean somewhat rising incomes for people. It does mean that it should mean that housing prices should at least stop their decline, and there's some sign in the residential market that that's happening. I think it's important, though, one very important factor that we don't have an index for, the government does, is the unemployment rate. And it's very important for people to understand how the unemployment rate behaves. It's a lagging indicator.
Okay.
And so that means that as we turn around, unemployment is not going to improve until later. Most people, it's now at about 10%. Most people think it will stay at about 10% for 2010, and then it will start to slowly improve. And it's important for people to realize that that doesn't mean that the economy isn't turning around. It's a problem. and we expect it to lag. And if it goes up in 2010, or if it doesn't start to go up in 2011, then I think that's an indicator that the normal economic pattern of recovery isn't taking place.
Doesn't seem to be something that a lot of the politicians understand, because they seem to think that this is like a TV show, and as in the, an hour after you put out the plot line, everything's supposed to resolve.
Well, I think there's, to be fair to our colleagues in Washington, the unemployment rate is the most direct measure of human impact as it relates to the economy. We all know what it feels like, or know someone, or have experienced it ourselves, of having lost a job. And the other measures, the leading index, it's a mathematical calculation. The consumer confidence survey is a survey, but losing someone's job is very tangible and real. And so I don't know to what degree the politicians are good macroeconomists, right, but I understand why they are so anxious for the unemployment rate to improve.
One of the sage observations that's been shared with me over the course of this crisis as it's unfolded is that this appears to be a transformative time, transformative time for our economic system, our transformative time for the political relationships that flow from it. And that the thing about transformations is that when they're complete, you're in a different place. You're not going back to where you are. You're in a different state. So is this just another up and down cycle, or are we seeing fundamental shifts in economic society?
Huh. Well, I guess it depends on on the time frame in which one would answer that question. I think in the short run, meaning the next 2 or 3 years, it's just another economic cycle. We've taken perhaps radical steps to change the cycle. We're going to have to deal with some of the implications of that, but fundamentally it's a cycle. Growth was negative, now growth will turn positive. It will be either 2% this year or 3%, depending on which camp you're in, but it will look like a regular cycle. I think if we try to answer your question over the next couple of decades, we really are, in fact, at a transformative point. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we're seeing an unprecedented amount of financial innovation, of deregulation, and globalization. And these forces are accelerating, and they've now reached a point, all three of them, where they have had and they are continuing to have a huge impact on everyone's economy. It's not possible to shield yourself from any of those forces. I think they have affected us in the past, as you've often pointed out, but we have to figure out how to engage those three forces and manage them. Do we want to limit them? They have enormous benefits. How do they interact with each other? So I think kind of getting a handle on that is going to be very important, and has the potential to transform the economic environment in which we all operate, not this year, but over the next decade or two. I think the second fundamental transformative change that's taking place, and this has been going on for a long time, but it's now really accelerating, is the relative role of the developed economies and the developing economies. And I think that we are now at or very close to what might be called a tipping point. And for all of our effective lifetimes and our colleagues, we've been the dominant model, political and economic model, and that is now going to change. And it's going to change during our lifetimes. And the question is, what does that mean? What are the opportunities for us, and what are the threats? And so I think both of those issues are kind of hanging over all of us. Again, not for 2010, but for the next couple of decades.
I want to talk a little bit about what that means for New York as an international city. Yeah. I also want to talk about the relationship, so the impact that this has had on the public and their view of the business community and